Hello, fantasy friends. I'm the Raging Redhead Cam Stewart from HotRoster today, and we're at a critical point of the season, folks. It's week 13, and the focus all week long is going to be on making that final push for a prime playoff position, or maybe just keeping you out of last place. Either way, lineup decisions become especially tough towards the end of the year, and today I'm here to give you the best and worst plays at the running back position this week. Week 12 was just another week with 100 total yards for Mr. Jordan Howard of the Chicago Bears. The rookie from Indiana has now recorded 4 consecutive games with double-digit fantasy points and at least 100 yards from scrimmage. His 5.1 yards per carry ranked third in the league, giving him one of the highest floors in fantasy football. And this week, Howard and his buddies from the Windy City are home to that sieve known as the San Francisco 49ers defense. This past weekend, the 49ers D gave up their 14th touchdown on the ground this season. That's the most in the NFL. Sure, the yardage wasn't there for J.H.I., and we'll get to that a little bit later on. It also still doesn't change the fact that San Francisco has given up 177 total yards per game to opposing running backs over their last 4 games. In that same stretch, the Niners have also given up 7 scores to running backs. Plus, Jordan Howard has been so consistent since winning back that starting job. Over the last month, Howard has recorded runs of 15, 22, 27, and 69 yards in each of those contests, while averaging about 20 touches a game. The man is simply a machine. He's also averaging 3.3 yards after contact this season, and that appears to consistently grow his role in the passing game. When you consider the 11 targets he's seen over the last 2 weeks, I feel really good about his chances to go off against San Francisco, and you should too. So make sure you start this guy if you have him and pick him up on HotRoster, because I'll guarantee he'll be running circles around that Niners D. Moving on from the future of the Bears running game to a blast from the past. Matt Forte, the former Bear, now turned New York Jet, has had a share of ups and downs this season. Week 12 was one of those down weeks for Forte, but it's worth reminding you of a couple things. One, that game was against the New England Patriots, and the Pats hold one of the best rush Ds in the league. And in case you missed it, they've held all running backs out of the end zone over the past month. Second, despite his inconsistencies, Forte's 142 fantasy points still ranks 7th among running backs this season. So given the right matchup, we should expect to see the good Forte, the one that recorded 4 straight games of double-digit fantasy points before meeting the Patriots in Week 12. And wouldn't you know it, this upcoming Monday night, the Jets are at home to the Indianapolis Colts, and you gotta love the opportunity it gives for Forte. Indianapolis on average gives up 20 fantasy points to running backs this season. They also allow 4.6 yards per carry, putting them amongst the bottom 5 in the NFL for that stat category. I think we see Forte get at least 80 total yards and a score against the Colts. He's a borderline RB1. So make sure you start him if you have him and pick him up on HotRoster, given the right matchup. The back that just finished lining up across from Forte and the New York Jets this weekend was LeGarrette Blount of the Patriots. And just like his buddy Forte, Blount's performance was underwhelming on Sunday. He finished with only 67 yards rushing on 11 carries, and thus only had 6.9 fantasy points, his second lowest single game total this season. But again, it's hard to blame the guy. The Jets' rush D has only given up 2 touchdowns to opposing running backs over the last 5 weeks. They've also prevented backs from scoring on the ground 7 different occasions. And backs have only averaged 4 yards a carry against the Jets. So it goes without saying that Blount was facing an uphill battle in Week 12, and you might have been inclined to think the same this Sunday. But with the Rams, when they visit Foxborough, hey, there's a lot to be excited about. On the surface, the Rams' rush D ranks in the middle of the pack, but over the last 4 weeks, the 462 yards they've given up on the ground is only behind the Brownies and the Niners. Maybe that stat isn't too surprising when you consider the fact LA gives up 4.4 yards per carry, the 6th highest yards per carry total this season. I think you throw in a power runner like Blount to exploit that. Plus, it seems like no one likes playing at Foxborough more than Blount. He scored 7 touchdowns in 5 home games this season. And Sunday won't be any different. I think he tops 15 fantasy points. You need to start Blount and pick him up on HotRoster in Week 13. The running back that just finished carving up the Rams defense was Mark Ingram of the Saints. Coming off a concussion and facing an old nemesis, defensive coordinator Greg Williams. Ingram, along with all the Saints, other than Brandon Cooks, went off. The former Alabama star rushed the ball 14 times for 146 yards and a score. He even added a 21-yard screen pass that he took to the house for another score, giving him a week-high 28.7 fantasy points. My concern, though, for Ingram, in spite of that recent success, is twofold. First, he's off to Detroit to face the Lions, and Detroit has only allowed 2 rushing touchdowns all season. They've also shut out running backs from scoring both on the ground and through the air 6 times this season. And no individual back has topped 75 yards against them since Jordan Howard did way back in week 4. Second, my other concern with Ingram is volume. Against a tough rush defense, you would like to see a back consistently be fed the rock so they can overcome it and break a big run to salvage the day. But Ingram, he isn't seeing a higher percentage of snaps. Last week, he was on for only 57% of the Saints' offensive snaps. And despite Tim Hightower playing on less snaps, Timmy outtouched Ingram 17-16. So without the volume and in a difficult matchup, I think it's time to pass on Ingram, sit him if you have him, and sure to be pressed down against this guy on HotRoster. Hey, do you remember when Jay Ajayi was the hottest thing in fantasy football? Remember that time he rushed for 200 yards in consecutive games, becoming only the second Dolphins back to do so since Ricky Williams? Only feels like a distant memory now, right? Well, because it is. Over the last 4 weeks, Ajayi's rushing totals have declined from 111 to 79 to 77. And then this weekend, he posted only 46 yards against the Niners. And we're talking about the same Niners who give up on average 149 yards on the ground. Just incredibly disappointing. I mean, it's not all Jay Ajayi's fault. He does lead the league with an average of 3.4 yards after contact, so it's not as if he isn't creating more opportunities for himself. The problem seems to be that teams are both doing a better job at containing him, and the Miami offensive line isn't getting that same push up front. Hopefully for Ajayi's sake, Laramie Tunsil could return for week 13. That would be a big boost for the running back. The only problem is it wouldn't change the fact that the Dolphins are in Baltimore playing a very stout Ravens rush D. Baltimore allows a league best 66 yards per game on the ground. They've also only allowed 2 scores on the ground to running backs, shutting out running backs out of the end zone on 8 occasions this season as well, and only giving up 3.4 yards per carry. So after a blazing hot start, it's hard to love Ajayi given the difficult matchup. I got to pass on this guy, put him on the pine for the week, and look to bet against him on HotRoster. Last but not least, my final sit for running backs in week 13 has to be Frankie Gore of the Colts. Gore and his pals from Indy are off to the Big Apple for a Monday night showdown with the Jets. The problem, if you remember when I talked about LeGarrette Blount, was that the Jets' rush defense, hey, these guys are pretty good. I mentioned how they've only given up 2 touchdowns to opposing running backs over the last 5 weeks, and how they've also prevented backs from scoring on the ground in 7 of 11 games this season. That's all kind of bad news for Gore. Not to mention, Gore has, as expected, worn down since his blazing hot start to the season. He hasn't topped 65 yards since week 6. He's only scored twice on the ground over his last 7 games as well, and he's been shut out in 6 of those 7 starts. So when you factor in a bad matchup, the regression in performance, and just consider that Gore, hey, he's pretty over the hill at 33 years of age, that spells all kinds of trouble. Sit Gore if you have him. It's a no-brainer, and pick against him on HotRoster. Well, that's it for today, friends. Make sure to join us tomorrow when we tackle the wide receiver outlook for week 13. And for those of you who don't know what HotRoster is, you got to check it out. Go to HotRoster.com, download the app, give it a try. It's like no other fantasy game you've ever played. And then for help winning the game, check out HotRoster today with me and Gary and Thorne every weekday at 4:30 Eastern, only on the Fantasy Sports Network. For HotRoster now, I'm Cam Stewart, and I'll see you on the virtual gridiron.